Colin Strickland had just received devastating news: his ex-girlfriend, Anna Wilson, had been brutally murdered. The message came with a chilling gravity that would forever alter his life. Hours earlier, a frantic call had been made to Austin's emergency dispatch. The voice on the line trembled with shock and fear. "My friend is staying with me," the caller stammered, "and I just walked in. She's on the bathroom floor. There's blood everywhere." The dispatcher tried to maintain control. "Is she awake? Is she breathing?" "No. There's blood all over her face, on the back of her head. She's not breathing." The caller was Caitlin Cash, who had returned to her home on Maple Avenue to a scene that would haunt her forever. Her friend, Mariah Wilson, was unresponsive, lying in a pool of blood. Paramedics were dispatched immediately, but it was too late. Mariah Wilson, a professional cyclist with a bright future, was pronounced dead. The details were horrifying, but the truth behind the crime would prove to be even darker. When investigators arrived, the scene initially suggested a robbery gone wrong, until a series of damning clues emerged. These were not the chaotic signs of an opportunistic thief but the calculated marks of a premeditated murder. It wasn't just a crime, it was a betrayal wrapped in obsession and jealousy. The evidence pointed not to a random intruder but to someone chillingly close to Mariah. A love triangle was at the center of it all, a web of deceit, passion, and ultimately, deadly obsession. As the investigation unfolded, the question everyone was asking became unavoidable: who would kill Mariah Wilson, and why? And, perhaps most disturbingly, how far would someone go to eliminate a rival in love? This wasn't just another tragic crime. It was the unraveling of a carefully constructed facade, a glimpse into the depths of human darkness. Each clue brought detectives closer to the shocking truth and a revelation that no one could have expected. This is the story of Mariah Wilson, the life she lived, and the love that turned fatal. Officers on the scene began piecing together the timeline as Caitlin Cash recounted the events leading up to the horrifying discovery. According to her, Mariah Wilson had been spending time with Colin Strickland, her ex-boyfriend, earlier that day. The two had gone swimming, and Caitlin had left the house for dinner around 5:30 p.m., leaving Mariah alone. By the time Caitlin returned, just minutes before calling 911, she found Mariah lifeless on the bathroom floor. The details were chilling, but they raised immediate questions. Mariah was alive and well when Caitlin left. What had happened in the short span of time before her return? And why had Colin, the last known person to see Mariah alive, not come forward yet? As officers gathered more details, the forensic team made a disturbing observation: cerebrospinal fluid pooling on the floor. This vital fluid, which protects the brain and spinal cord, indicated that the gunshot wounds had penetrated Mariah's skull. Death had been instantaneous. There had been no chance of saving her. Caitlin was the only witness the police had at the moment, and they needed answers fast. The initial statements painted a picture of a seemingly ordinary day, but there were glaring gaps in the timeline. Officers pressed her for more information. "Did Mariah and Colin have any kind of argument?" one detective asked. "I don't think so," Caitlin replied, her voice trembling. "She just told me they were meeting up to go swimming. That's all I know." "What time was that?" 5 p.m. maybe. I can check my texts. I left for dinner at 5:30, and when I came back, I don't know what happened." Caitlin's account confirmed that Colin had been with Mariah just hours before her death. This put him squarely on the radar as a person of interest. But who was Colin Strickland, and why was his connection to Mariah so significant? Colin wasn't just Mariah's ex-boyfriend. He was a well-known figure in the cycling world, a professional cyclist with an impressive career. His relationship with Mariah had been brief, but it had ended months earlier. Despite this, the pair had reportedly remained friends. However, as police would soon discover, this wasn't the whole story. Colin wasn't just an ex-boyfriend trying to maintain a friendship. He was deeply entangled in a love triangle, one with tensions that had been simmering for weeks. Further investigation revealed that Colin had been in a long-term relationship with another woman, someone who had reportedly been less than thrilled about his connection to Mariah. This wasn't just a casual dynamic, it was one filled with jealousy, resentment, and, as the evidence would soon suggest, a motive for murder. Detectives wasted no time tracking Colin down for questioning. His whereabouts in the hours following Mariah's death became their top priority. Where had he gone after swimming with her? Why hadn't he called or checked in? Colin's responses would shed some light on the events of that day, but they would also deepen the mystery surrounding Mariah's tragic death. Each answer led to more questions, and a darker, more sinister narrative began to emerge. As the investigation unfolded, police uncovered a tangled web of lies, betrayal, and desperation, a deadly combination that would lead them to a shocking conclusion. What had started as a seemingly random crime was quickly unraveling into something far more calculated and personal. The truth, when revealed, would leave everyone involved reeling. And it all began with one fateful encounter on a seemingly ordinary day. Mariah Wilson's murder took another puzzling turn when officers learned that she had brought with her a $114,000 racing bike to town for the upcoming bike race. The bike's absence from the crime scene raised suspicions. It could have been a potential motive for a robbery gone wrong. Investigators speculated that someone might have waited for Mariah to be home alone, planning to steal the expensive bike, only for the situation to escalate into a deadly encounter when Mariah resisted. This theory gave officers their first actionable lead. If they could locate the missing bike, it might lead them straight to the murderer. The search began immediately, starting with the area surrounding the house. Caitlin Cash told investigators that Mariah usually kept the bike just inside the door, but now it was nowhere to be found. Officers fanned out, combing through nearby woods for any sign of the valuable piece of equipment. Then came a breakthrough, or so it seemed. "Hey, over here," an officer called out. Amidst the underbrush, they found the bike. But the discovery didn't bring clarity, it brought confusion. The bike had been dumped in plain sight, just far enough from the house to seem hidden. "This doesn't feel right," one detective muttered. "It's too easy." The officers suspected the bike had been deliberately placed as a diversion, a red herring to send them down the wrong path. If the killer was cunning enough to stage this, they were likely already taking steps to cover their tracks. It was a chilling realization, they weren't dealing with an amateur. Back at the house, investigators shifted focus to hard evidence. Shell casings from the bullets used in the murder were recovered near the body. These casings were crucial, they could help identify the gun and, potentially, the shooter. The forensics team moved swiftly, knowing the clock was ticking. Meanwhile, officers couldn't ignore the possibility of Caitlin Cash's involvement. Despite her distraught demeanor, standard procedure required that she be cleared of any suspicion. At the station, detectives explained the next step. "Let me be upfront," one officer reassured her. "By no means do we think you had anything to do with this. But we need to conduct a gunshot residue test on your hands. If we don't, it could raise questions in court about why we didn't follow through with every part of the investigation." The gunshot residue, GSR, test was conducted, and the results were negative. This result, combined with the narrow space in the bathroom where Mariah was killed, led officers to conclude that Caitlin was not the shooter. However, she provided them with a critical piece of information. Mariah's last known interaction was with Colin Strickland. As detectives dug deeper, they discovered that Colin and Mariah had met for drinks earlier that day at a nearby cafe. By all accounts, it seemed like a casual meetup between two old acquaintances. Colin had then left Mariah at Caitlin's home, not realizing it would be the last time he saw her alive. But Colin's connection to Mariah wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. Police soon uncovered a tangled relationship dynamic, one that placed him at the center of a potentially deadly triangle. It wasn't just Colin and Mariah, they now had a third name to investigate, Caitlin Armstrong, Colin's long-term girlfriend. As police pieced together the timeline, the shadow of jealousy began to loom large. Caitlin Armstrong had every reason to feel threatened by Mariah Wilson, a former flame of Collins who had re-entered his life in recent weeks. And as police would soon discover, the tension between these three individuals had been building for far longer than anyone realized. With this new information, Colin Strickland was no longer just a person of interest. He was the key to unraveling the deadly web that had ensnared Moriah Wilson. Detectives prepared to bring him in for questioning, knowing that what he revealed, or chose to withhold, could be the turning point in the case. Detectives were closing in on a crucial connection between the black Jeep captured on CCTV near the crime scene and Colin Strickland's home. The vehicle in question wasn't just a random coincidence, it was parked in plain view in Colin's driveway, complete with a bicycle rack attached, matching the description of the getaway car seen on camera. What's more, the Jeep wasn't registered to Colin. It belonged to his girlfriend, Caitlin Armstrong. This discovery shifted the focus of the investigation dramatically. While Colin was still a person of interest, the evidence now pointed to Caitlin as a key suspect. The potential motive was chillingly clear: jealousy. Moriah and Colin had a brief romantic history during a short break in Colin and Caitlin's relationship. Although Colin and Caitlin reconciled, it became apparent that Caitlin was far from over the affair, and she wasn't happy that Colin had stayed in touch with Moriah. Officers brought Colin in for questioning 2 days after the murder. They needed to establish a timeline for his whereabouts during the critical hours and, more importantly, probe for any clues that might implicate Caitlin. Colin's demeanor during the interview raised eyebrows. His inability to maintain eye contact and his visibly anxious state could have been shock, or a sign of guilt. The interview began with routine questions about the events of the day. Colin explained that he and Moriah had spent time together before heading to a bar for drinks. "Y'all left around 6:30, an officer asked. "I don't think that's accurate," Colin replied, fidgeting in his seat. "We must have left for burgers at about 7:45 or maybe later. It was probably closer to 8, just as it was getting dark." "What about the bar? Did anyone act strange around Moriah? Maybe someone watching her or approaching her?" "No," Colin said, shaking his head. "She doesn't live here, so she didn't know anyone. No one hit on her or acted weird. At least not that I noticed." The detectives weren't just listening to his words, they were watching his body language, looking for signs of deception. They also wanted to connect the dots between the black Jeep and Caitlin Armstrong. "Whenever I was at your place earlier," one detective said, steering the conversation, "I noticed the Jeep parked outside. Is that yours?" "No," Colin replied quickly. "That's my girlfriend Caitlin's car." This admission confirmed what police already knew. Caitlin Armstrong wasn't just tangentially connected to the case, she was now a primary suspect. Her Jeep had been spotted driving toward Caitlin Cash's home on the night of the murder, only to reappear in Colin's driveway shortly after. Investigators needed more than circumstantial evidence to tie Caitlin to the crime, but the pieces were starting to fall into place. They uncovered that Caitlin had a history of jealousy, particularly when it came to Colin's interactions with Moriah. Caitlin's animosity toward Moriah was no secret, she had even confronted Colin about his continued friendship with her on multiple occasions. The next step for detectives was clear. They needed to bring Caitlin in for questioning, but they would soon find out she wasn't going to make that easy. Caitlin Armstrong, as it turned out, was already one step ahead of them. As the investigation pressed forward, detectives would uncover a calculated and chilling attempt to evade justice, one that revealed just how far someone was willing to go when consumed by jealousy and rage. Detectives knew they were closing in on Caitlin Armstrong. Colin Strickland's timeline, supported by text messages and receipts, gave him a solid alibi. Caitlin Cash, the witness who discovered Moriah Wilson's body, had already been cleared by the gunshot residue test. That left Caitlin Armstrong as the only suspect whose movements on the night of the murder remained suspiciously vague. Detectives noticed troubling inconsistencies in Caitlin's supposed alibi. Colin mentioned that Caitlin had a laser hair removal appointment at 7 p.m. downtown and later texted him to meet up, but her whereabouts after that were unaccounted for. When she finally returned home, she was in yoga clothes and carrying a yoga mat, yet there was no confirmation of where or when this supposed yoga class took place. The gaps in her story were glaring, but they needed more than circumstantial evidence to arrest her. Then, a routine search of the police database gave detectives a surprising break. Caitlin Armstrong had an active warrant for her arrest. Though it was for a minor infraction unrelated to the murder, it was enough to legally bring her in for questioning. This small lead was the opportunity they needed to confront her directly about Moriah Wilson's death. When Caitlin arrived at the station, detectives approached her cautiously. They knew they couldn't immediately accuse her of murder, so they began the interview under the guise of routine questioning. "All right," Detective Connor said as he sat down across from Caitlin. "I'm Detective Connor, and my partner is actually speaking with Colin right now. I wanted to come in and start chatting with you so you don't have to wait too long. It sounds like you may have some information or might have witnessed something important." Caitlin appeared calm but guarded. She maintained her composure as she answered the initial questions about her relationship with Colin and her activities on the night of the murder. However, her answers lacked the specificity detectives were hoping for. "You mentioned you were downtown for a laser hair removal appointment at 7 p.m. Detective Connor began. "Can you confirm which clinic that was at?" "I don't remember the exact name," Caitlin replied smoothly. "It's one of those places near South Congress. I go there regularly." "And after that? Did you go straight to yoga?" "Yes, I had a class nearby." "Which studio?" Connor pressed. Caitlin hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to catch the detective's attention. "I don't think it was a formal studio. It was more like a group class, outdoors." "And you came home around 9:20? "Yes." Detectives noted her vague responses and lack of corroborating details. There were no records of her appointment or yoga session. Meanwhile, evidence from surveillance footage placed her Jeep near the crime scene at the same time Moriah Wilson was killed. The pressure mounted when detectives began to ask about her relationship with Colin and his connection to Moriah. "Caitlin," Detective Connor said, leaning forward slightly, "we know Colin had a brief relationship with Moriah while you two were separated. Did that ever cause tension between you and Colin?" "No," Caitlin replied curtly. "We moved past all that." "But you were aware they were still in contact?" Connor pressed. "That didn't bother you?" Caitlin's jaw tightened. "I trusted Colin," she said flatly. Detectives continued probing, subtly highlighting the jealousy and tension that had been reported by people close to the couple. But Caitlin didn't falter. She maintained her innocence and stuck to her story, even as detectives laid out the evidence they had against her. The interview ended without a confession, but detectives left with one undeniable conclusion: Caitlin Armstrong was hiding something. While her calm demeanor might have convinced others, her vague timeline, unaccounted movements, and her Jeep being linked to the crime scene painted a damning picture. The investigation shifted into high gear as detectives worked to build a case strong enough to arrest her. They knew time was running out. If Caitlin realized how close they were, she might make a desperate move. And as it turned out, Caitlin Armstrong had no intention of waiting around to see what happened next. Detectives had Caitlin Armstrong right where they wanted her, sitting in an interrogation room, subtly unnerved and under the pretense of addressing a minor warrant. The officer maintained a casual tone, explaining the supposed theft of service charge and deliberately keeping the focus vague. This tactic was intentional. They wanted Caitlin to let her guard down, creating an environment where she might inadvertently provide information about Moriah Wilson's murder. "I guess the warrant is just a Class B, something about theft of service," the detective said with a dismissive shrug. "It's nothing major, but I wanted to chat with you about some unrelated stuff while you're here." Caitlin's unease was palpable. Despite the officer's calm demeanor, she was visibly tense. Sensing an opening, Caitlin began probing about her rights and legal counsel. "If I have an existing warrant, and you don't know what it's about, do I need an attorney here?" Caitlin asked cautiously. The detective leaned back slightly, keeping their voice steady. So, the warrant is just a minor thing, like I said. The reason I'm here is that your name came up during a conversation with Colin. There's some information I think you have that could help clarify a few things he mentioned. To do that, I'll need to read you your rights, just so you're aware and protected. Caitlin nodded hesitantly. Okay, so, you're reading me my rights because of the warrant? Exactly, the detective replied smoothly. Because of the warrant, you're technically in custody. But these are two separate things. Does that make sense? I think so, Caitlin murmured, her discomfort evident. The tension in the room was thick, and despite the detective's efforts to maintain control, the situation was about to take an unexpected turn. Just as the officer began steering the conversation toward the events surrounding Mariah's death, a knock came at the door. The interruption was followed by a colleague entering the room with an unexpected update: the warrant was invalid. Well, good news, the officer said, turning back to Caitlin. Apparently, the warrant was issued with the wrong date of birth. It had your name, but it's for a different person entirely. So technically, you're not under arrest. Caitlin's expression shifted slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time during the interrogation. The officers had lost their legal hold over her, and Caitlin was now free to leave. The mistake had just allowed their prime suspect to walk out of the station. As Caitlin gathered her belongings and left the precinct, detectives scrambled to regroup. Losing her wasn't just a procedural hiccup, it was a devastating blow to the investigation. Caitlin Armstrong, who they strongly suspected of orchestrating Mariah Wilson's murder, had slipped through their fingers due to a clerical error. Now, it was a race against time. Detectives knew Caitlin might use this opportunity to disappear, covering her tracks and potentially destroying any remaining evidence. If they didn't act fast, justice for Mariah Wilson could slip further out of reach. The atmosphere in the interrogation room shifted dramatically as the detective made one last-ditch effort to get Caitlin Armstrong to talk. With her request for an attorney already on record and her insistence on leaving, the detective knew they were walking a fine legal line. Yet, with no concrete way to hold her, they had to play their strongest card. Caitlin, the detective said, leaning forward slightly, their tone calm but firm. We have footage of your vehicle near Mariah's house around the time of her murder. That's why this is so important. I need your side of the story to explain why your Jeep was there. Without it, it doesn't look good. Caitlin stiffened, her expression carefully controlled. I don't understand what you're implying, she replied, her voice measured. I wasn't at her house. But your vehicle was, the detective countered. Look, I'm not saying you did anything, but if there's an innocent explanation, if you were just in the area or had no idea what was going on, this is your chance to clear that up. Caitlin's eyes flickered with something, maybe anger, maybe fear. I'd like to leave, she repeated, her voice sharper this time. I don't know what Colin has told you, but I didn't even know he was seeing Mariah. I have nothing else to say. The detective took a breath, recalibrating. I get that you're frustrated, they said, softening their tone. And I'm not here to make you feel cornered. But right now, with what we have, if you leave, the story we're left with is what Colin told us and the fact that your Jeep was spotted at the scene. You can see how that looks, right? Caitlin shook her head, her resolve firm. I don't know why my vehicle would be there. Maybe someone else drove it. I'd like to speak to a lawyer. Her words were a clear signal, the conversation was over. Legally, the detective had no choice but to respect her request. All right, the detective said, standing up and gesturing toward the door. We'll stop here. You're free to go. Caitlin gathered her belongings and walked out, leaving the detectives with more questions than answers. They had played their strongest hand, and she hadn't cracked. Now, all they could do was continue building their case and hope they could gather enough evidence to bring her back in, this time, under arrest. As Caitlin left the station, detectives were already strategizing their next steps. The clock was ticking, and they knew she might use this window of freedom to cover her tracks. Surveillance on Caitlin intensified, and the search for additional evidence became a race against time. The question remained, would they be able to prove her involvement before she slipped out of their grasp for good? Detectives knew the second interview with Colin Strickland wouldn't be easy. With his lawyer present, their ability to probe deeply into Caitlin Armstrong's behavior and any possible motive for Moriah Wilson's murder was limited. Still, they pressed forward, hoping to gain insights into Caitlin's mindset and uncover any signs of jealousy or obsession that could tie her to the crime. Colin, visibly more cautious this time, spoke carefully. Caitlin and I had a complicated relationship. I mean, we were on a break for a while, and during that time, I did start seeing Moriah. But that was brief, and by the time Caitlin and I got back together, I thought things had settled. The detectives leaned in. You mentioned earlier that Caitlin wasn't happy about Moriah being around. Can you elaborate on that? Colin hesitated, glancing at his lawyer, who nodded for him to proceed. She didn't like it, no. I mean, she was upset when she found out Moriah was in Austin. But it wasn't like she confronted her or anything. Caitlin kept things to herself most of the time. She could get jealous, sure, but it wasn't something I thought would escalate. When you say jealous, how did that usually manifest? One detective asked, careful to keep their tone neutral. Colin shifted uncomfortably. She'd get quiet, sometimes make comments about how I should be careful about who I spent time with. But I thought it was normal relationship stuff. I didn't think she'd dwell on Moriah or see her as a threat. Especially because, during our break, Caitlin was seeing other people too. She even went on dates while we were still living in the same house. The detectives exchanged glances. Caitlin's outward actions suggested she was moving on, but the internal reality might have been different. Her relationship with Colin appeared to have unresolved tensions, especially regarding his connection to Moriah. Did Caitlin ever say or do anything that made you think she might act on those feelings of jealousy? The detective asked. No, Colin said firmly. I can't imagine Caitlin hurting anyone. She's not. She's not that kind of person. I mean, yeah, she got upset sometimes, but nothing violent. If she was angry, she'd usually just walk away or shut down. Detectives weren't convinced. Caitlin's outward calm didn't align with the evidence placing her Jeep near the crime scene or her evasive answers during questioning. They needed more from Colin, particularly about Caitlin's actions after Moriah's murder. What about the night Moriah died? The detective pressed. Did Caitlin mention anything unusual when she got home? Colin paused, clearly wary of saying too much. She didn't say much. She seemed normal, maybe a little quiet, but that wasn't unusual. She said she'd been at yoga and then came home. I didn't push for details. It was clear Colin was either genuinely unaware of Caitlin's potential involvement or unwilling to believe it. His statements painted Caitlin as someone capable of jealousy but not murder, a contradiction that left detectives wondering if he was withholding information out of loyalty or fear. The interview concluded with little concrete evidence, but it deepened the detectives' resolve. Caitlin Armstrong's carefully constructed image was beginning to crack under scrutiny. Her alibi didn't hold up, her Jeep was linked to the crime scene, and her behavior during questioning suggested she was hiding something. Yet, Colin's insistence on her innocence added another layer of complexity. As detectives walked out of the interview room, they knew they needed more. The focus now was on uncovering Caitlin's actions in the hours before and after Moriah's murder. Surveillance footage, digital records, and any potential witness testimony would be critical to finally cornering her before she disappeared for good. Caitlin Armstrong's arrest in Costa Rica was a major breakthrough in the case, but her actions while on the run revealed the extent of her desperation. After altering her appearance with cosmetic surgery and taking on a false identity, she was finally caught by officers who recognized her unmistakable eyes. She was extradited to the United States and charged with first-degree murder for the death of Moriah Wilson. Despite her capture, Caitlin continued to be a high-risk detainee. In the months following her arrest, she remained combative during court proceedings, maintaining her innocence despite the mounting evidence against her. By October 2023, her case was progressing toward trial, but Caitlin had other plans. While awaiting trial at the Travis County Correctional Complex, Caitlin attempted a daring escape. On the evening of October 22, during a routine exercise period, she exploited a security lapse in the facility. Surveillance footage revealed Caitlin sprinting across the recreation yard and scaling a 12-foot perimeter fence. The prison's alarm system activated, but Caitlin had already vanished into the surrounding woods before guards could apprehend her. A manhunt was immediately launched, involving local law enforcement, U.S. Marshals, and even FBI assistance. The escape dominated headlines, with warnings issued to the public about Caitlin's potential danger and her resourcefulness in evading capture. Authorities feared she might have outside help or a pre-planned escape route, given her prior use of a fraudulent passport and ability to fund her time on the run. For nearly 2 weeks, Caitlin evaded authorities, using her knowledge of survival techniques and reportedly traveling on foot and by stolen vehicles. Tips from the public began to flood in, with multiple reported sightings across Texas and neighboring states. Each lead brought authorities closer, but Caitlin remained elusive, showing a remarkable ability to stay one step ahead. The break came when a vigilant off-duty officer spotted Caitlin at a remote gas station in Del Rio, near the Texas-Mexico border. Caitlin had altered her appearance again, wearing a blonde wig and oversized sunglasses, but the officer recognized her from recent wanted posters. Acting quickly, they alerted nearby units, and a coordinated operation was launched to apprehend her. As officers surrounded the area, Caitlin attempted to flee once more, stealing a vehicle parked near the gas station. A high-speed chase ensued, spanning several miles before Caitlin lost control of the vehicle and crashed into a ditch. She was arrested on the spot and taken back into custody. This time, authorities ensured there would be no further escape attempts. Caitlin was transferred to a high-security federal detention facility, and her escape added multiple charges to her record, including escape from custody, auto theft, and resisting arrest. By the time her trial began in early 2024, prosecutors had compiled a mountain of evidence against her. This included the CCTV footage of her Jeep near the crime scene, cell phone data placing her at Mariah's home during the murder, the matching bullets from the gun Colin had purchased for her, and the digital trail of her escape to Costa Rica. Witness testimony from Colin Strickland and others painted a clear picture of Caitlin's obsessive jealousy and erratic behavior in the months leading up to Mariah's death. Despite her attempts to deflect blame, the jury delivered a unanimous verdict of guilty. Caitlin Armstrong was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Mariah Wilson's family and friends, the verdict brought some measure of closure, but the loss of a bright and talented young woman remained a source of deep pain. Caitlin's actions were a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked jealousy and obsession. As Caitlin began her life sentence, the story of her crime and escape attempts served as a chilling case study in how far someone would go to avoid accountability, and the resilience of law enforcement in pursuing justice for a senseless and tragic murder. Caitlin Armstrong's final, desperate attempt to escape justice came during a routine doctor's appointment outside the high-security facility where she was being held. Surveillance footage captured the dramatic moment she bolted from a bathroom window, attempting to flee yet again. However, this time, officers were prepared. Within moments, Caitlin was tackled and restrained by law enforcement just yards from the building. This failed escape attempt was the last in a series of actions that only further solidified her guilt in the eyes of both the public and the jury. Coupled with her prior use of fraudulent documents and an international flight to Costa Rica, her behavior painted a picture of someone willing to go to extreme lengths to evade accountability. The trial, which concluded nearly a year and a half after Mariah Wilson's murder, was a culmination of meticulous investigative work. Key evidence presented to the jury included surveillance footage showing Caitlin's black Jeep near the scene of the crime, testimony from Colin Strickland, who detailed Caitlin's jealousy and obsessive behavior, as well as the timeline of events leading up to Mariah's death. Ballistic analysis that definitively matched the shell casings found at the scene to the firearm Colin had purchased for Caitlin. Cell phone data and GPS records proving Caitlin's movements aligned with the time and location of the murder. Eyewitness accounts and CCTV footage from her time on the run, showcasing her elaborate efforts to conceal her identity. Despite her defense team's attempts to argue reasonable doubt, the prosecution's case was airtight. On November 16, 2023, Caitlin Armstrong was found guilty of first-degree murder in the cold-blooded killing of Moriah Wilson. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before delivering their verdict, a testament to the overwhelming evidence against her. Caitlin was sentenced to 90 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence ensured that she would spend the rest of her life behind bars, unable to harm anyone else or escape the consequences of her actions. For Moriah Wilson's family and friends, the verdict was bittersweet. While justice had been served, it could never bring back the bright, talented cyclist whose life was tragically cut short. Moriah's legacy as a trailblazer in her sport and a beloved friend to many would live on, overshadowed only by the senseless nature of her death. Caitlin Armstrong's case became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of the destructive power of jealousy and obsession. It also highlighted the determination of law enforcement to pursue justice, no matter how far or how long it took. As Caitlin began her life behind bars, the world moved forward, carrying the memory of Moriah Wilson, a life full of promise that was stolen too soon.